My stepmom tried to erase my existence from my own family history. She claimed my dad's house was hers, even after I paid them $60,000 for it. I didn't yell. I did this instead. She ended up losing everything and paying my legal fees. Hi everyone. I'm Sarah, 34F, and I've been lurking on this subreddit for months, reading stories that hit way too close to home. I never thought I'd be writing one of these posts, but here we are. Maybe putting this all down will help me process what happened, or maybe some of you will recognize the particular brand of family dysfunction I've been dealing with. Either way, I need to get this off my chest. This story starts with my dad, Marcus, and a blended family situation that went sideways in ways I'm still untangling. My parents divorced when I was 8, and Dad remarried Patricia when I was 12. She came with 2 kids of her own, Jessica, now 29, and Brandon, now 26. For a while, we actually functioned like a real family. Patricia wasn't cruel, just distant, professional. She treated our house like a well-managed hotel where everyone had their assigned roles. Dad was a software engineer, the quiet type who showed love through actions rather than words. He'd help with homework, fix broken things, and always made sure I felt included in family decisions. The house we lived in was his pride, and Joy, a 1920s craftsman he'd bought right after the divorce and spent years renovating. Every weekend was a new project, refinishing hardwood floors, updating the kitchen, building custom bookshelves. I was his constant helper, learning to use power tools and understanding the difference between load-bearing walls and decorative ones. When I turned 18 and left for college, things shifted. Patricia's kids, who'd always been polite but never particularly warm, seemed to settle into the house like they'd been waiting for me to leave. Jessica moved back in after dropping out of her master's program. Brandon never left at all, bouncing between part-time jobs and what he called finding himself. Meanwhile, I was 3 states away, working 2 jobs to pay for school because Dad's salary was stretched thin supporting a household of 5. The first crack in the foundation came during my junior year. Dad called me one Tuesday night, voice strained in a way I'd never heard before. He'd been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. He was only 54. What followed was a gradual erosion of everything I thought I knew about my place in the family. Dad's condition progressed faster than anyone expected. Within 18 months, he needed full-time care. Patricia, to her credit, stepped up as his primary caregiver, but she also became the gatekeeper of information. Doctors' appointments happened without me knowing. Financial decisions were made in conversations I wasn't part of. When I'd call to check in, she'd give me brief clinical updates. He's having a good day, or the medication is helping. I graduated college and moved back home, thinking I could help care for Dad and maybe rebuild some family connections. But the house felt different. Patricia had rearranged the furniture, replaced Dad's favorite reading chair with something more practical. The workshop in the basement, where Dad and I used to build things together, had been converted into a storage room for Jessica's art supplies. When I asked about it, Patricia said they needed the space, and that Dad didn't use it anymore anyway. The worst part was watching Dad struggle to remember me while seeming to have no trouble recognizing Patricia's kids. I knew it was the disease, not favoritism, but it still hurt. Jessica would sit with him for hours, showing him her paintings, and he'd nod and smile. When I'd try to remind him about our weekend projects or the treehouse we'd built together, he'd look at me with polite confusion. Dad passed away 2 years later, on a rainy Thursday morning in March. I was at work when Patricia called. The funeral was small, respectful, and somehow felt like it was about a stranger. Patricia had chosen the music, the readings, the flowers. She'd written the obituary without asking for my input. In it, she mentioned his loving wife and children, but somehow made it sound like Jessica and Brandon were his only kids. 3 weeks after the funeral, Patricia called a family meeting. We sat around the same dining table where we'd eaten countless dinners, and she laid out the situation with business-like efficiency. Dad had left the house to all 4 of us equally, but there was a problem. The mortgage was larger than anyone had realized, and the property taxes were behind. The house needed significant repairs. The roof was leaking, the electrical system was outdated, and the foundation had some settling issues. "We have 2 options," Patricia said, sliding a folder across the table. We can sell the house and split whatever's left after paying off the debts, or someone can buy out the others and take on the responsibility. Jessica immediately said she couldn't afford to buy anyone out. Brandon nodded in agreement. Patricia sighed and said she'd looked into it, but her credit wasn't good enough to qualify for a loan that size. Then they all looked at me. I'd been working as a project manager for a tech company since graduation, and I'd been careful with money. I had savings, good credit, and honestly, the idea of losing the house felt like losing Dad all over again. So I agreed to buy them out. We had the house appraised, calculated everyone's share, and I took out a loan to pay them each their portion. It wasn't cheap, about $60,000 total, but it felt worth it to preserve the place where I'd been happiest. What I didn't realize was that this was exactly what Patricia had been counting on. The buyout process took about 6 weeks to complete. During that time, Patricia was nothing but helpful. She organized Dad's belongings, helped me understand the house's various systems, and even left me detailed notes about maintenance schedules and preferred contractors. Jessica and Brandon were equally cooperative, packing up their things and making plans to move out. But then the closing date got pushed back due to some paperwork issues. Then it got pushed back again. And somehow, in all the delays and complications, Patricia and her kids just stayed. When I'd bring up the timeline, Patricia would apologize and promise they'd be out soon, but there was always another reason for the delay. Jessica's new apartment fell through. Brandon was waiting for his first paycheck from a new job. Patricia was having trouble finding a place that would accept her credit score. Meanwhile, I was paying the mortgage, the utilities, the property taxes, and the insurance. When I gently suggested that maybe they could contribute to household expenses while they were still living there, Patricia got emotional. She talked about how hard it was to leave the place where she'd cared for Marcus, how the kids were struggling financially, how she'd put her own life on hold to be his caregiver. I felt guilty for even bringing it up. Months passed. I was essentially paying for a house I shared with 3 people who treated me like a temporary roommate. They'd make decisions about household things without consulting me, changing the internet provider, rearranging the living room, even painting the guest bathroom a color I hated. When I'd object, Patricia would remind me that they were grieving too and that Marcus would have wanted us to support each other. The situation came to a head last spring. Patricia announced that she was planning a memorial gathering for the 1-year anniversary of Dad's death. She'd invited extended family, Dad's old coworkers, and family friends. The gathering would be held at the house, naturally, since it was where Marcus was happiest. I found out about this plan the same way everyone else did, through a Facebook event invitation. When I confronted Patricia about it, she acted surprised that I was upset. "I thought you'd be happy," she said. "It's important to honor his memory." But as I read through the event details, I realized she'd positioned herself as the grieving widow hosting a memorial in the family home. There was no mention of the fact that I now own the house, no acknowledgement that I'd been the one maintaining it for the past year. She'd even posted photos of the house's interior, showcasing the renovations she'd made without asking me. The guest list was the final straw. She'd invited people I'd never met, while somehow forgetting to include several of Dad's closest friends, people who'd known me since I was a kid. When I asked about it, she said she'd tried to keep the gathering small and intimate. That's when I realized what was really happening. Patricia wasn't just struggling to move on, she was actively rewriting history. In her version of events, she was the devoted wife who'd sacrificed everything for her husband, now left to carry on his legacy in the family home. I was just a supporting character, the stepdaughter who'd moved away and come back to help out. I started paying closer attention to things after that. I noticed that Patricia had been giving people a tour of the house, showing off improvements she'd made. She'd hung new family photos in the hallway, pictures that included her kids, but somehow excluded me. She'd rearranged Dad's home office, removing the certificates and awards from his engineering career and replacing them with Jessica's artwork. Most troubling, she'd started telling people that the house was staying in the family and that she was keeping Marcus's memory alive by maintaining it. When neighbors would ask about the ownership situation, she'd give vague answers that implied she was still the rightful occupant. I decided to do some digging. I pulled the mortgage records, the property tax records, and the insurance policies. Everything was in my name, just as it should be. But when I checked the voter registration records, I found that Patricia, Jessica, and Brandon had all updated their addresses to list my house as their primary residence. They'd been living there for over a year, paying nothing, while I covered all the expenses. I also discovered that Patricia had been collecting mail for Dad's business accounts. He'd done some freelance consulting work and had apparently been managing those accounts without telling me. There wasn't much money involved, but it was another example of her taking control of things that weren't hers to manage. I decided to handle this directly. I sat Patricia down one evening and laid out the situation clearly. I explained that I'd been more than patient, but that I needed a firm timeline for when they'd be moving out. I also mentioned that I'd discovered they'd been using my address for official purposes and that this needed to stop. Patricia's response was immediate and dramatic. She started crying, talking about how cruel I was being, how I was destroying the family that Marcus had worked so hard to build. She said that Jessica and Brandon considered me their sister, and that kicking them out would be something Dad would never forgive. When I pointed out that I'd already paid them their inheritance and that they'd agreed to move out, she shifted tactics. She claimed that the house was too big for just me, that I was being selfish, and that the memorial gathering was proof of how much the community valued her role in preserving Dad's memory. "This isn't about money," she said. "This is about family. This is about honoring what Marcus wanted." But I'd heard enough. I gave them 30 days' notice to vacate the property. Patricia threatened to contest the ownership, claiming that Dad had promised her she could stay in the house for as long as she wanted. When I asked her to produce any documentation of this promise, she couldn't. The memorial gathering was scheduled for a Saturday in late April. I'd made it clear that Patricia and her kids needed to be moved out by then, but as the date approached, it became obvious they had no intention of leaving. In fact, Patricia had doubled down on her plans, even hiring a catering company and renting tables and chairs. On the Friday before the event, I changed the locks. I also contacted the catering company and the rental company, explaining that I was the homeowner and that the event had been canceled. I provided them with copies of the property deed and my identification. Both companies were understanding and agreed to cancel the services. On Saturday morning, I watched from my living room window as cars began arriving for the memorial gathering. Patricia stood in the driveway, looking confused and increasingly panicked as she realized she couldn't get into the house. Jessica and Brandon arrived with their belongings, apparently planning to help set up, only to find themselves locked out as well. I waited until about a dozen people had gathered outside before I opened the front door. The conversation stopped immediately. Patricia looked at me with a mixture of fury and desperation. "Sarah, thank God," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "There seems to be some problem with the locks. Could you let everyone in?" I stepped onto the porch, still holding the door closed behind me. "I'm sorry," I said to the gathered crowd. "There's been a misunderstanding. This event was planned without my permission, and I've had to cancel it." The murmur of confusion that followed was exactly what I'd expected. Several people looked back and forth between Patricia and me, clearly trying to understand the situation. "This is Marcus's house," Patricia said, her voice rising. "This is where he lived, where he wanted to be remembered. Sarah, you can't do this." "Actually," I said, pulling out a folded document, "this is my house. I bought it from the estate and have been paying all the expenses for the past year and a half." Patricia and her children were supposed to move out months ago. I handed the property deed to one of Dad's former coworkers, someone I'd known since I was a teenager. He looked at it, then at Patricia, then back at me. "I think there's been some confusion," he said diplomatically. "Maybe we should all take a step back." But Patricia wasn't done. "She's trying to erase Marcus's memory," she said, tears streaming down her face. "She's throwing out his family, destroying everything he built. This isn't what he would have wanted." I felt the familiar guilt creeping in, the same feeling that had kept me from setting boundaries for months. But then I looked at the crowd of people who'd come to honor my father, and I realized that most of them barely knew me. In Patricia's version of events, I was the ungrateful stepdaughter who'd abandoned the family and come back to claim what wasn't mine. "My father," I said, my voice steady, "spent years teaching me to take responsibility for what's mine and to stand up for what's right. I've been supporting this household financially while being excluded from decisions about it. I've been patient and generous, and I've been taken advantage of. This stops now." The crowd dispersed quickly after that. A few people approached me privately to express their condolences and to say they hadn't realized the situation. Dad's former coworker, Tom, stayed behind to help mediate. He convinced Patricia to gather her immediate belongings and leave peacefully, with the understanding that she could arrange to collect the rest of her things later. Over the next week, I dealt with a series of angry phone calls and text messages. Jessica accused me of being heartless. Brandon claimed I was dishonoring Dad's memory. Patricia alternated between tearful apologies and threats of legal action, but I also heard from people I hadn't expected. Several of Dad's friends reached out to say they'd been wondering what had happened to me, that they'd assumed I was too busy with my own life to stay in touch. Neighbors mentioned that they'd been confused about the living situation but hadn't wanted to pry. My Aunt Linda, Dad's sister, called to say she'd been concerned about Patricia's behavior but hadn't known how to address it. The most surprising call came from my stepbrother Brandon. 3 weeks after the memorial incident, he called to apologize. He said he'd been going along with his mother's narrative because it was easier than confronting the truth, but that he realized how unfair they'd been to me. He didn't ask to come back to the house, didn't make excuses, just acknowledged that they'd taken advantage of my grief and generosity. Patricia did follow through on her threat to contest the ownership, but her case fell apart quickly. She couldn't produce any documentation showing that Dad had promised her lifetime occupancy. The will was clear, the buyout was properly documented, and I had records of all the payments I'd made on the house. Her lawyer advised her to drop the case, but not before she'd racked up several $1,000s in legal fees. She also had to pay my attorney's costs, which added insult to injury. The most satisfying part of the legal process was when my lawyer discovered that Patricia had been claiming the house as her primary residence for tax purposes, which meant she'd been receiving a homestead exemption she wasn't entitled to. She had to pay back the difference, plus penalties. It's been 8 months since the memorial gathering incident, and the house finally feels like home again. I've been slowly undoing the changes Patricia made, restoring Dad's office, and putting his photos back in their proper places. I found some of his old project notes in the basement and used them to finish a bookshelf he'd been working on before he got sick. Patricia and her kids moved to an apartment across town. We don't speak, though I occasionally hear updates through mutual acquaintances. Jessica is working as a barista and still painting. Brandon got a job at a local manufacturing plant and seems to be doing well. Patricia found work as a home health aide, which is actually a good fit for her skills. I've started hosting my own gatherings, small dinners with Dad's old friends, neighbors, and the family members who actually want to maintain a relationship with me. These events feel genuine in a way that Patricia's memorial never could have. We share stories about Dad, look through old photos, and remember him as he actually was, not as someone's carefully curated version of him. The house itself has become a source of joy again. I've been continuing Dad's renovation projects, learning new skills, and making the space truly mine while honoring his memory. I converted the spare bedroom into a home office and turned part of the basement into a workshop where I can build things the way Dad taught me. What I didn't anticipate was how this experience would change my relationship with the extended family. Word spread quickly through Dad's relatives about what had happened, and the response was mixed. Some people thought I'd been too harsh, that family should stick together regardless of the circumstances. Others were supportive, saying they'd watched Patricia's behavior with concern but hadn't known how to intervene. The most surprising response came from my dad's brother, Uncle Ray, who lives in another state. He called me about a month after the memorial incident to tell me something he'd never mentioned before. Apparently, Patricia had contacted him shortly after Dad's diagnosis, asking about Dad's financial situation and whether there were any family assets she should know about. Ray had found the conversation odd at the time, but hadn't said anything because he didn't want to cause problems. He also told me that Patricia had reached out to several family members over the years, positioning herself as Dad's primary caregiver, and suggesting that I was too busy with my own life to be involved. She'd been building a narrative of abandonment and neglect that made her look like the devoted wife and me like the absent daughter. This revelation helped me understand why some family members had seemed distant over the years. They'd been getting a very different version of events, one that painted me as selfish and ungrateful. The truth was more complicated, but by the time I learned about Patricia's campaign, the damage was already done. One of the most difficult aspects of this whole situation has been dealing with the judgment from people who don't know the full story. In a small community, word travels fast, and not everyone gets the complete picture. Some people still see me as the stepdaughter who kicked out her grieving stepmother. Others understand that I was protecting myself from being taken advantage of. I've had to learn to be comfortable with the fact that not everyone will understand my choices. Some people will always see family loyalty as more important than personal boundaries, regardless of the circumstances. But I've also discovered that the people whose opinions actually matter, the ones who knew my father well, and who took the time to understand the situation, have been overwhelmingly supportive. The financial impact has been significant too. Between the legal fees, the months of supporting 3 extra people, and the cost of changing locks and security systems, this situation has cost me close to $15,000. But I've come to see it as the price of my independence and peace of mind. Looking back, I can see the warning signs I missed or chose to ignore. Patricia's gradual takeover of the house wasn't accidental. It was a calculated strategy to establish herself as the rightful occupant while positioning me as the outsider. Her emotional manipulation, her rewriting of family history, and her use of my grief against me were all part of a pattern I didn't recognize until it was almost too late. I've learned that grief can make us vulnerable to people who want to take advantage of our desire to honor our loved one's memory. Patricia knew that I wanted to preserve Dad's legacy, and she used that against me by claiming that her version of events was what he would have wanted. I've also learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set firm boundaries, even when it feels harsh. Dad taught me to stand up for what's right, and that includes standing up for myself. He wouldn't have wanted me to be taken advantage of, even by people who claim to be acting in his memory. Today, the house is truly mine. I've finished most of the renovation projects Dad started, and I've added a few of my own. The workshop in the basement is functional again, and I've been learning woodworking techniques from YouTube videos and books Dad left behind. There's something deeply satisfying about using tools he taught me to use, creating things with my hands the way he did. I've also been reaching out to Dad's old friends and coworkers, rebuilding connections that were damaged by Patricia's narrative. Many of them have told me they're glad to have me back in their lives, that they'd missed hearing from me, but hadn't wanted to intrude on what they thought was a difficult family situation. The memorial gathering that Patricia had planned never happened, but I organized a different kind of remembrance. On Dad's birthday last month, I hosted a small gathering of people who actually knew him well. We shared stories, looked through photo albums, and planted a tree in the backyard, something Dad had always talked about doing but never got around to. It was exactly the kind of event Dad would have enjoyed. Low-key, genuine, and focused on the people he cared about rather than making a statement or preserving an image. I know some people will read this and think I was too harsh, that family should forgive and forget, that I should have found a way to make it work. But I've learned that not all family relationships are worth preserving at any cost. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's harmful behavior, even when they're grieving, even when they claim to be acting out of love. Patricia and her kids aren't evil people, but they were willing to take advantage of my grief and generosity in ways that were ultimately destructive to all of us. By setting boundaries and enforcing them, I gave everyone a chance to build healthier relationships based on honesty rather than manipulation. The house that was once a symbol of family dysfunction has become a symbol of my independence and strength. Every room holds memories of my father, but they're my memories now, not someone else's carefully curated version of them. When I sit in his old reading chair or use his tools in the workshop, I feel connected to him in a way that was impossible when I was constantly walking on eggshells around Patricia. I still miss Dad every day, but I no longer feel guilty about the choices I've made. He raised me to be independent, to think for myself, and to stand up for what's right. In protecting the home he left me, I honored his memory in the most authentic way possible. So that's my story. A blended family that fell apart after a death, a stepmother who tried to rewrite history, and a daughter who finally learned to set boundaries. It's messier than I would have liked, more expensive than I anticipated, and more emotionally draining than I expected. But it's also been a lesson in self-respect, in the importance of honoring our loved one's memory without sacrificing our own well-being. Was I right to change the locks and cancel the memorial? Did I go too far in having them evicted? Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm still processing all of this, and sometimes I wonder if I could have handled things differently. But I'm also proud of myself for finally standing up for what was mine and refusing to be manipulated by people who claim to love me while taking advantage of my grief. If you've made it this far, thanks for reading. If you've been in a similar situation with family members who don't respect boundaries, I hope my story helps you feel less alone. And if you want to hear more stories like this, hit subscribe and tap the bell. Apparently that's what I'm supposed to say now.